Hi guys, Chris Parkin here. I'm just going to do a quick tutorial on shadows and another way of doing them for composite images, and hopefully give you a few tricks and tips along the way. Now this is predominantly for 106. I'm going to use some of the similar information for 206 later, but get into a little bit more of the complexities of that you can run into. Okay, so for starters, let's grab the image that we're going to be adding to this, and it's simply going to be one of my daughter's Lego mini figurines. Now, I took this image at the same time of day as all of the others. Let's disable the layer mask. Excuse the little black dots. I'd been doing some masking and had the wrong layer selected, so be careful when you do that. Okay, you'll note that the two images have the same color tone and the same type of shadows, and the reason for that is I took them at exactly the same time of day. In fact, they were taken about 30 seconds apart. I'm going to play with the wall and actually use that for showing the 200 level, casting fairly difficult shadows, so hopefully you'll see this later. But for now I'm going to find a new background, and now finding the new background brings up some interesting problems. You have to match the lighting very, very closely. If you don't, things start going haywire because they don't line up. So let's reapply that mask, and I'll show you the first image that I located for doing this. And I thought, oh, this one's nice, it's late afternoon sun, and then realized fairly quickly on these trees are about that high. So if you draw a line between the top of the tree and the bottom and the top of the shadow, the angle that the light is cast on is about 45 degrees. That would be fine, except that the angle is much shallower if you follow the line of the shadow on the minifig. So you've got to have the same lighting and the same angles. They're both coming from behind, but this one's a much shallower angle, and if you don't have them right, then trying to get them to match just becomes a real nightmare. Hence why if you're doing your own composite images, it's easier to take everything at the same time. Once you've got your exposure correct for the first image, lock your camera off in fully manual exposure and go and take the other images and get the angles lined up. And the advantage of that is, as long as you get your exposure right and you haven't got burnt out highlights and all the other bits and pieces, then when it comes to actually putting them together, they look the same because your color temperature and everything else is the same to start with. Speaking of color temperature, remember to lock off your color balance to manual, otherwise your camera will be changing those colors on you. I usually have mine permanently set to daylight because it gives me the freedom to do the changes later, and of course you're shooting in RAW, it's a fairly easy change. Right, so on to business. Okay, what else did I take at the same time? Well, I took another shadow that looks like this, and this one I was originally planning on taking to grab the shadow of the minifig, but I soon realized that I actually taken it from slightly the wrong angle. You actually need to be blocking the sunlight hitting your object, and that way you can then take the silhouette of the object and apply it as your new shadow. I stuffed up, and as you can see, a little bit out, so had to retake this, and I've gone and used different lighting for it. The advantage of doing this is I've now got a nice clean background. We're not going to be using the light on the minifig, we're just going to be using the shape. And if we go back to being able to see our minifig, it's pretty close to the angle that we need. The only thing I've forgotten is that this piece of the hand, the shadow actually ends on the body. So when I do my selection, I don't want that hand actually sticking out, otherwise we're going to have that shadow there as well. And it's attention to detail like this that really lifts the images to make them so they don't look like they've been photoshopped and people are going, how on earth did you get a minifig that's that size? Of course you make one out of fiberglass and that's all sorts of fun, but let's not do that for today. Okay, so the selection that I have used, I'm going to have to do again because I got rid of it. I was thinking of cheating. Never mind. Right. So to do the selection, you can use pretty much any tool in your kit. This one's probably my favourite for a relatively simple selection. Just run it over and zoom in and check that you've got your selection pretty close to right. You can use all the refine tools. The challenge here is we've got a lot of reflection from the plastics, so I'm going to have to grab the polygon lasso tool and just physically grab the rest of this. Now of course this is not going to look like anything like what the shadow's going to be by the time we've finished, but it gives us a nice starting point and gives us a shape. So if you're working with your own images, you've got the advantage of being able to do this and not have to guess where everything's going. Alright, let's drag that across there, nice big shadows for the feet. Straight across up here, because remember we're getting rid of that shadow, and we're not going to want that button shadow either, but we are going to want the arm, so I'm going to add that back in a couple of minutes. Okay, so that gives us most of the shadow, most of the outline and the silhouette. Okay, that's looking pretty reasonable. Get the head a little bit better. And of course, because we're going to be doing this non-destructively, if you realise that you've made a mess of it, you can go back in and paint, because we're going to be using layer masks. My favourite tool, just simply because they're non-destructive and we do have that option of fixing things later. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Okay, so to double check that, we're going to actually dump it into our adjustment layer. So adjustment layer, curves, and that gives us our curve, and you can see that that curve is now just going to act on the edge of the minifig. If you press the backslash key, that'll give you the outline of that. It's good enough for what we want. We're going to end up playing with it later, so that's fine. Right, so we can hide that shadow layer, and of course this is now in the wrong place, so we need to drag it down underneath the minifig, and we need to go and find a proper image, and this one's from Duncan Harris, and it's Kew Gardens. And so these shadows are much closer to the type of light that we actually need. You know, long shadows, slightly blue tinge to them, and even you can see the blue on even the red pieces of the Lego minifig, and they're going back down this way, so I think we should be able to make this one work. Okay, let's turn our shadow back on. We're going to have to crop the image and get rid of bits later, but that's fine, we can play with it. Control T gives us our transform, and we're going to tip him on his side, and you'll note fairly quickly that the perspective is off, and that's because the shadows are much thinner. So it's the first thing that you need to do is start moving those shadows around and get it into a situation where it looks like it's the right size for the job. Shadows going back just a little bit, and you can even see the shadow coming through and behind the Lego minifig, which is always a good start. Okay. Shrink that shadow down a little bit. Remember, if we draw our line across here, we'll just start seeing the edge of the hand if we get our angles lined up right. It's looking not too bad. Go perspective, and of course this is going to depend on your image as to where those shadows need to be. Make them vanish a little bit more. Yeah, the shape's looking pretty good there. Okay, so we've sorted the shape. We're going to have to do some fine tuning around the feet. See, the shadows don't start until the edge of the feet actually get there, but that's okay. We can do that fiddling as we go, because we've got a layer mask and we can just tweak it as needed. Now we will line that up so that the edge of this shadow starts and goes to the tip of the toes, because that is important. Otherwise it's going to make a bit of a mess later. Okay, so that's cool. we'll come back to that and lock that in. But the next thing you'll notice is that the shadow colours are all over the place and they're considerably different to what we're looking at. Okay, so how do we deal with that? Well, you've got the tone curve, so you can change the whole curve of it. And now we can see some of the detail in behind the shadows, but the bright spots are sticking up too much. So we actually need to drop the highlights and the exposures and the highlights, and that's starting to look a little flatter. What's the next thing we're missing? We're missing that blue colour, and that's the nice thing about being able to use curves. We can go and grab the blue, and if you lift it up, it will add a bit more blue to the tone. Now this is where it becomes fun, because you have to balance your colours as much as possible, and it really does take a little bit of playing before everything falls into place. It's getting closer and closer. One way that I have found of making sure that you've got these right is grab your clone stamp tool and grab a piece of somebody else's shadow, and we'll create a new layer and just drop it next to it. Now if you stick it there and then you go back to your curves layer, you can see that the actual shadow is a fraction lighter, and now it's a fraction darker, and that's now pretty close to being the right colour. There's a little bit of a difference in some of the shading, so we'll go back to our blues and see if we can work out what that is. And it really does become a fine-tuning job, but that's the nice thing about this. You can get it and roughly done, fine-tune it, come back and keep tweaking. So I'm reasonably happy with that. The next thing we've got is, you notice the edge of all these shadows are feathered, and they're fairly hard at this edge where the foot meets the road, and as you get further away from the person, then you end up with more and more feathering. So first things first, duplicate your layer. That's going to throw all the exposures off. That's fine. We're going to hide one of those layers, and the reason for that is you're going to change this. You can't change it back. Take a backup. If you take a backup at this point, you don't have to go and do all the cutting out again. Speaking of backup, Control S, save. If you don't save things, they cause you all sorts of grief. Okay, so we want our blur tool, which is this one, and working on the curves layer, and just blur the top of the shadow more than the bottom, and that's looking a lot more realistic. Okay, now we need to go and zoom in and sort out some of the shadow on this side of the foot. So to do that, there's a few options. My general preference is go with a brush, set the hardness to very hard because we're dealing with hard edges, and simply make sure I'm on the right layer. Yes, make sure I've actually got a brush selected and not the excuse me, had the brush selected and not the clone tool. Nothing will work that way. And make sure our opacity and flow are up. That's cool. And just go in and get rid of that. I'm just going to get rid of that feathering a little bit more. And so this one's going to get a little bit trickier. We need to clip out some of the shadow there because it's going to go back and cast a shadow in a similar line to everything else. So clip that back in. Oops. And then you remember from the previous assignment that you've got a little bit of reflection on the layer as well. So to do that, there's a few options, but we'll show you the other trick. We'll go off with a bit of a larger hardness, and we're just going to dodge and burn this, and this is the very simple dodge and burn function. Change your blend mode to multiply, and then drop your opacity right back, and that just gives us more of that concrete reflection. Now you note we've got this edge glow and I've got a black halo around here, so this is one of the few times that I would go and use a eraser and just get rid of some of that. Oops. Okay, so let's zoom out a fraction and see that's getting pretty close to right. It's a little bit purple. There's a little bit of a purple hue in that now. So we'll go back into our curves layer, double click on the curve piece itself, and the purple's probably coming from that red in the highlights. There we go. Let's zoom out, and yeah, as I say, you can always come back to this later. And actually, with any image, it's a good idea to come back to it a few days later. Last thing we need to do is crop. Make sure we're not deleting the crop pixels. Again, non-destructive. And okay. And yeah, so hopefully that gives you a few tricks and tips about how to get your shadows right. I'm still not convinced about the color of the shadow, but it is very close to those ones. You do end up with some variation because you end up with the shadow bouncing off from one person to the next. And the other thing to watch out for is this cast shadow. If it was any stronger, I'd actually want to clone out the original shadow in the concrete, because otherwise you end up with the shadow doubling up, and that gets messy. Let's actually just move him, link those 2 layers, 3 layers, and move them all backwards, and you'll see what happens when it goes over another shadow, and that just looks really fake because that's not what happens in real life with normal shadows. They don't multiply unless you've got 2 light sources. So yeah, hopefully that gives you some ideas of what you can do with shadows and curve tools, and yeah, gets you unstuck from some of the stuff. Cool. Any questions, remember, sing out, ask your tutor.